must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support, and now for the show. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Poen, and today I have the esteemed pleasure of welcoming Dr. Pamela Levangie, who, if you're not aware, is the current president of the Academy of Physical Therapy Education. And she was also the department chair at MGH Institute of Health Professions and was awarded Professor Emeritus status in 2017. And we brought Pam on today to talk about the Education Research Task Force that has been going on, but also about the Academy of Physical Therapy Education and a few other education research topics as well, just to kind of dive into this topic a little bit more. And, you know, Pam, thanks so much for all your hard work and dedication to the PT profession. Because I know you've done a lot throughout your whole career thus far. And, you know, I really appreciate your efforts and the time that you're going to be spending with us today.
Well, it's very much my pleasure, Brandon, and I enjoy what I'm doing, so it's great.
Well, that's the best part of it, right? And, you know, I realize, though, that there are some listeners out there that may still not know a little bit about you. Would you mind sharing with our listeners your story into how you got into academics and even to where you are now as the president of the Academy?
Well, you can tell by my gray hair, it's probably a pretty long story, but I'll try to make it very short. I got into teaching because after being in the clinic for a few years and having students in the clinic, I suddenly decided that unexpectedly I really liked teaching. I only had a bachelor's degree at the time, which was the entry-level degree, and so I didn't think I could go into academia. But through what were really a series of mistakes, I applied for a position and got it at Boston University. That was about 45 years ago. Started teaching there during my 23 years at Boston University. I got both my post-professional master's degree there in physical therapy, as well as my Doctor of Science in epidemiology. And those were obviously degrees I needed to get to stay in academia. But just turned out to be, especially my doctoral degree, just opened up entire new worlds for me. I started my involvement in APTA with the section on research. I was on the, I think, Public Relations Committee at the time, ran for office a few times, lost a few times, kind of persisted, and suddenly ended up as president of the section after losing secretary and vice president. So persist when you're trying to volunteer. I served as president for 2 terms. After a short break, I actually went back to the section and served as secretary for a couple terms. At that point, I really felt that I wanted to do some volunteering and donate some time and effort to the educational community. But when you're involved in section activities, it's really difficult to be very involved in 2 sections. So after I finished my involvement in the research section, I ran for a board position on ACAPT, that's the American Council of Academic Physical Therapy, and was on the board for 2 years. During that time, a lot of things transpired within the education leadership partnership formation, a number of other things. And the president of what was then the education section had served out her 2 terms. And I really felt that this was an opportunity to move into the position for at least a term and use my experience and background to kind of do a turnkey kind of operation, to really bring together what's now the Academy of Physical Therapy Education, or APTE, and ACAPT in particular, because there had been at least some folks who perceived them as not being compatible, and I didn't agree with that. So I'm now halfway through my term and very much enjoying it, very excited about this opportunity as I finish out my career.
I love it. And I think, you brought up so many good little lessons throughout your story there. And especially, I really love the one where you kind of had said how you had gone through running for all these positions and failed, frankly, but continued to persist. And I think that's such a good, important message for people to hear. And, I realize that some people may not be aware of what APTE or the Academy specifically is and what they do. Would you mind just sharing specifically kind of what the Academy is and kind of specifically what is being done within the Academy, just to give some context to those who maybe don't know about that?
Sure, absolutely. Probably the easiest thing to do is I'm going to actually just read the mission statement and then elaborate from there. So the mission is to inspire all PTs and PTAs in their role as educators, and to enhance the development and implementation of evidence-based educational practices. Our brand is every PTA and PTA is an educator. So if you look at our strategic plan, which is about to change, we're going to have a strategic planning meeting next month. It's still about dissemination of evidence-based resources for best practices in teaching, promoting scholarly activities, and increasing professional development opportunities. So one thing every section will say, or every academy will say, it's about networking. And that's certainly the case. But the academy really works hard at promoting professional development. We have educational sessions, platforms, and posters at CSM, ELC, for your readers or listeners who don't know ELC, it's the Education Leadership Conference, and it's the primary conference for physical therapy educators, PT and PTA, and is held jointly with ACAPT in the fall. The Academy also offers a faculty development workshop for new educators, as well as, for the first time this year, a mid-career faculty development workshop. And we'll talk about some of our other efforts in terms of supporting scholarship as we go along. But that's sort of a very broad brushstroke of what the Academy is about.
No, absolutely. I think you did a good job with that. And I also kind of just wanted to point out to listeners too, is that within the Academy, as Pam had kind of mentioned, there are also a lot of special interest groups within it that cover a wide variety of topics, depending on what you're interested in. And I'm not going to name them all, but a couple of the big ones: clinical education, residency fellowship, and there's many more, but there's definitely a lot of avenues on different areas of education that they have covered. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that, Brendan. There's 6. In addition to the ClinEd and I forgot the other one you named. It's academic faculty, anatomy educators, clinical education faculty, whether they're in the clinic or in the academic environment, PTA educators, the fellowship and residency that you mentioned, and scholarship of education is our 6th one. So you can belong to one or more as long as you belong to the Academy.
Love it. And, Pam, of course, the topic, one of the big topics of discussion today kind of is involved around the Education Research Task Force. As we've heard from many guests on the podcast before, of course, about the demand and the need for more educational research, but there's also been a lot that's been done to look at that and improve that already thus far. But to kind of start at the beginning here, why and how did this task force form, and what was the specific charge given to the task force to look at this?
There was a motion that was brought to the floor of the Academy Business meeting at CSM a year ago, so that's CSM 18. And that motion specifically was to consider putting together a task force to explore funding up to $1 million from the Academy to support various educational activities. And that motion specifically referenced looking at ways in which those monies might be used to support the Journal of PT Education, the Foundation for Physical Therapy, collaboration with the Education Leadership Partnership, and included representatives from each of those groups. So after the motion was passed at the business meeting, the task force was pulled together and started its work probably April or May of 2018. As they began their work, they began by looking at as many resources, existing resources, as they could find, so that they wanted to see if they could build on and complement what was already out there, rather than do something that was potentially redundant. So that's where they began their work.
Gotcha. And, kind of gathering that a little bit, how about did they go proceeding with kind of investigating this and kind of what they kind of did to kind of learn more about this and kind of to ultimately respond to the recommendations?
Well, it's an interesting charge because there's no roadmap out there that anyone has for how to go about doing this. And there's so many efforts scattered around so many different groups. The obvious ones that were clearly the low-hanging fruit is what the Education Leadership Partnership was doing, because they were certainly very active. And that is a group of which we are a partner. We're one of three. The partnership is APTA, ACAPT, and the Academy. We also could look internally at ourselves. What were we already doing? What was the foundation doing? What could we complement? And then were there things that we knew about or could find out about that, again, we could complement? So they did that work first. And from there, it's kind of tricky because you have to think about what, in jargon is, what's going to give you the best bang for your buck. I think initially they probably got a little hung up in what things would cost. And we kind of corrected and said, no, just don't worry about cost. That's the board's problem. Your problem or your charge is to how to best spend money. So they looked at probably two different strategies. One is to support individual researchers or small groups, so maybe a collaborative effort on supporting particular projects. That targets a few people, but it supports research that presumably will then be disseminated as best evidence. So a few people, but probably a big impact for those few people that then has a ripple effect. The other strategy is educational programs where maybe you can get to a larger group at a time through your efforts, but then you're less sure that it's going to result in a project or in published research. So I think there was an attempt to sort of pair the strategies, although in the end, the support was primarily towards individuals with the concept that everyone agrees on, and that is that we need to build a larger, stronger cohort of educational researchers who can mentor those coming up the pipeline. So there were two efforts that the Academy had already started. One was our so-called Adopt a Doc awards. An Adopt a Doc award is a amount of monies to help support those who are at the dissertation or project phase of their post-professional doctoral studies. We had, I think it was 2 awards. I'm pretty sure it was 2 awards at $2,500. And they increased that to $3,000. And those monies can be used in any way to support someone's doctoral program. It doesn't necessarily have to go to their project. It could be tuition, it could be materials. We ended up with 3 awards because Carden Rehab donated $3,000 to support 1 award within the Academy. While it's not required that those be graduate studies in educational research, folks who are pursuing educational research as their doctoral studies do have priority in the funding. So the little bump there. We also had a $10,000 grant that supported a single project that had to be in the area of educational research. It had been awarded every year, but we weren't getting a lot of applications. One explanation is, there's just not enough of a cohort of people out there doing educational research. The other was the concern that $10,000 simply wasn't sufficient carrot to get applicants because it might not be enough to support a full project. So one of the recommendations of the task force was to increase that award from $10,000 to $25,000 with the thought that for most types of educational research, that would provide enough of a pot to support a more rigorous study. Because they just made that recommendation this year, we were able to get it into the 2019 budget, but the call had still been for $10,000 projects. That call, the applications were due in October for awarding this year. Because we had the money, but the award was out for $10,000, this year we were able to actually award 2 full grants, as well as use some of the remaining pot of monies to award an additional 2 Adopt-a-Docs. This coming year, however, the call will be for a $25,000 grant. Again, applications due in October, and it will be announced at CSM along with the new Adopt-a-Docs in 2020. So that was, where we were with our immediate resources. Then additionally, the Academy had an endowment with the Foundation for Physical Therapy Research. Research is tagged onto its name now, where it was the Foundation for Physical Therapy. It is now the Foundation for Physical Therapy Research. But our endowment wasn't big enough to generate much in awards. So we were supporting what are known as PODS awards. PODS are Promotion of Doctoral Studies. And it was a PODS 1, which was typically $7,500 a year for someone in their pre-dissertation phase of their post-professional doctorate. And again, it had to be educational research. That was awarded periodically, but not every year. And part of that was some of the rigor of the applications wasn't strong. Again, speaking to our need for mentorship in educational research. So the biggest recommendation, what we hope will be the most impactful, is that the task force recommended that the Academy put $500,000 toward that endowment with the foundation. So we're in the process of working with the foundation now on a new agreement. That $500,000 will be put in what's known as the restricted fund. That's your nest egg. That doesn't get touched. And then there's additional monies, about $211,000 that was already in there. So that will be in the unrestricted funds. That will be what will go to support awards. So what we're presuming will happen is this year, depending on their funding cycle, in the next funding cycle, we will support one PODS 1. And again, that's to support doctoral studies. In the following year, we hope that there will be a $40,000 award to be distributed to support an educational research project. So that obviously is a bigger nut. The final recommendation of the task force was to support within the academy a $40,000 educational research grant that will be awarded for the first time this coming year. That is a specifically crafted award in that not only is it for educational research, but it's what's known as a mentored grant. So it is, you specifically have to have a mentor on your committee as part of the project. And it's really targeted at people with already a post-professional doctorate. So it's a so-called postdoc mentored award. And the goal of the task force was to hit all different levels. So our adopted doc and the pods support individuals trying to, in the process of getting their doctoral degrees. The $25,000 grant is fairly open. It has to be an educational research, but the credentials are not specified. So it's typically considered to be an early career type of award, whereas the $40,000 postdoc is considered to be further along the continuum of experience. So that there really was a very deliberate effort to fund at the different levels. So the research committee of the Academy is currently charged with developing the criteria for the new postdoc award, the $40,000. And those criteria hopefully will be posted and available on our website by, I would say, the end of March, and with the October 1st deadline for applications and announcement at CSM. So as you can see, there are a number of different initiatives that the task force supported and that were supported completely by the board.
No, completely. And, Pam, I recognize that there might be some younger faculty members or maybe some people listening that potentially want to look into doing something and contributing to our knowledge of education research. In your opinion, what do you think are the areas of education research that we know the least about and that we need to know more about to kind of get a better understanding of how we're doing as a profession?
We're so early in the game, Brandon, that the scope is pretty limitless.
Yeah.
However, that said, the one problem, the one barrier that we face is that we have very few validated outcome measures of what constitutes success. Now, there's a plethora of different, I'm going to use the word variables, that one could look at in terms of what quality education would be. How do you measure critical thinking? How do you measure professionalism? How do you measure clinical success? Have we made an impact with the patient? Even those are not necessarily strong, other than did their range of motion change? Did their quality of life change? But how much of that was actually due to the therapist's education or their own professional development is a whole different issue. How do we measure if folks are using evidence-based practice? That's probably one of the things that is going to be the most difficult thing to tackle. But the fact that we're at the ground level may work in favor, where we've got the partnership, APTA, ACAPT, and the Academy, all working together right now in the partnership on looking at outcome measures of across the spectrum, everything from how do we know if you're prepared to go out on your first clinical experience in entry-level education, through what does continuing competence look like, the entire spectrum. There's going to be a strategic, I guess they're calling it a strategic planning meeting on the outcome subgroup of the partnership. So maybe working together at ground level means that you're not going to have tons of different people and tons of different groups, each developing their own measures that we can't compare, which is one of the issues we have in our clinical outcomes right now. Everybody's got their own measure. So when you're looking at across studies, it's hard to compare what this study found to what this study found because they use different outcomes. So I would say that's the biggest challenge, as well as, I'm working another one in here as I'm thinking about it, getting our institutions to respect educational research. There's certainly a tendency to view it as less rigorous and less desirable when you think about promotion and tenure than the more objective types of clinical research. Educational research can certainly be quantitative, but it's often thought of as qualitative. And qualitative research is not as respected as it should be. It's seen as being very loosey-goosey, do whatever you want, and that's not the case. There is a number of methodologies that are rigorous, and I think it's changing. I think we're seeing more qualitative research. We're certainly starting to see what's known as mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative together. But when you're in an institution that has a strong arts and sciences college, they view research differently than we do within the health professions. And so respecting that educational research should be rigorous, that it's absolutely critical to professional education, and that degrees like education doctorate, so EDDs, are credible, competitive, viable degrees as long as you're in a strong program, which is true of any degree. You can get a PhD and be in, quite frankly, a not very good program. You can be in an EDD and be in a really strong educational program. So outcome measures, respect for educational research within our individual institutions, as well as within our profession. And tagged to that is respect for post-professional studies in education, regardless of the tag put on the degree.
No, I think that's a really, really solid answer, Pam. And you'd mentioned, of course, a lot with the task force specifically. But aside from talking with the task force, what other initiatives that you haven't mentioned from APTA, ACAPT, APTI, and others have also been created or fostered to also contribute to helping this issue of getting better and more educational research for PT out there?
Well, the Education Leadership Partnership, referred to as the partnership, also known as ELP, but the partnership was formed really to consolidate the efforts of the partners, very particularly, but not exclusively, in the area of educational research. So a number of subgroups were formed to help those efforts. One was to build one of the subgroups is totally dedicated to building a stronger community of educational researchers. I mentioned that there's an outcomes subgroup. There's also a resources subgroup, and they're really just fully engaging in their work now. They also will be holding a strategic planning meeting in the not too distant future. And each one of those is critical. We've gotten off the ground in the partnership with building the community first, and there are two particular initiatives that the partners are supporting. The first one is called MERC. It's the Medical Education Research Certificate. This is actually a series of 9 courses that were developed by AAMC, the American Academy of Medical Colleges. I think I've got that right. So it was developed by the medical educators, and we're having them deliver typically 2 courses at each one of our conferences, 2 different ones of the 9. So ELC, the Education Leadership Meeting, CSM, I don't think there was a set at next, but at least for a year. If you complete all 9 courses, there's actually a certificate in educational research that you get. You don't have to. You could take the courses piecemeal. So those have been offered for the last year and a half, and quite a number of people have engaged in those courses. I don't know if anyone's gotten to the certificate yet, but if not, there are definitely a few people that are close. So that's one effort that's been ongoing. One that just started this past year is called GAMER, and that's Grantsmanship and Mentorship in Educational Research. So again, the acronym is GAMER, and no one will ever remember what it stands for, just like Merck. GAMER is a mentored educational program. So this year, I think they accepted applicants, I think it may be 15 individuals. That application process included what needed to be a project that, at least preliminarily, they thought they wanted to engage in. They began with a very intensive 3-day on-site meeting where there were a number of sessions helping them understand the process of educational research. They were paired with a GAMER mentor as well as an institutional mentor to support their developing projects. And they had opportunities to sit down with their GAMER mentor multiple times during that intensive set of days. And over the course of the year, they continue to work periodically with their GAMER and institutional mentor to develop these projects. The goal is to basically prepare people to be ready to submit grants to get their research funded, which then develops the cadre for our academy grants and the foundation grants. There is a second cohort that will come in this year. So I think the application period is either open or just closed. I'm not sure which. And that will be the second cohort to go through. And having talked to a few people who were part of GAMER this year, it was very, very positively reviewed. Everybody, the participants and the mentors felt very strongly that this was really a great way. This is that, how do you have more people involved and support them? And then again, you have a little bit less control over what the product is, but it's really a very focused way to build that educational researcher community.
With PT education, there's a lot we're trying to learn more about. You had mentioned outcomes measurement, resource support, clinical education, new and improved models, and a couple other things as well. But I'm just curious because where do we stand compared to maybe other healthcare professions like nursing, medicine, when it comes to education, and what can we learn from them in terms of what they're doing?
Well, I think it's fairly clear that medicine has the lead in looking at educational research in medicine. And we are and do consistently look at them to see, not recreate the wheel. And Merck is a good example. We're using their courses. We're using their faculty. Whether we need to tweak that over time for ourselves to tailor it a little bit more to physical therapy remains to be seen. But right now, those courses seem to be going quite well. So yeah, we're certainly looking to them. I would say in terms of the other healthcare professions that are obvious, nursing, occupational therapy, speech and language pathology, their challenge is, I think they are less rigorous in looking at their outcomes, in their outcome measures. They're certainly looking at outcomes. I think that's historically been the case, although I will say that nursing probably is ahead of us in terms of accepting qualitative research as an acceptable research design. So we certainly are looking to nursing and what they've done for qualitative research. I think OT and SLP, it's probably similar, and I hope I'm not understating the work that they're doing, to their clinical measures, where they haven't been looking quite as objectively at the validity and reliability of their measures. And of course, I'm using quantitative research words, but there are correlates to validity and reliability, absolutely, within qualitative research as well. So I think that we're all still novices. I think that medicine did realize, perhaps before we did, that there's an art to teaching, and well, maybe nursing too, that we were so busy trying to be better clinicians that we really didn't pay attention, quite frankly, to the fact that we're about more than our clinical skills. And we're about thinking. We're about critical thinking. We're about clinical decision making. And the impact of how do you do that well? How do you teach that well? Can you teach that? And how does that translate into better patient outcomes? Those are things that I think even medicine is still struggling with a bit, and certainly we are. But the efforts we've just been talking about for the past few minutes are clear evidence that we've raised our recognition, that we're prepared as clinicians. The educator part of our role is demanding more attention now, I think, in entry-level programs and in things like residency and fellowship. But we're really still just getting our wheels going. We're just starting to really get forward momentum as opposed to wheel spinning happening. So I think we do have lessons to learn from the other professions, including those that might not be where we are, because the question is, why aren't they? What are we doing that's different? What can we learn from what they are doing, as well as those that have some structured educational research initiatives in place?
No, for sure. I mean, it makes complete sense to follow and at least look at kind of what other professions are doing and take what we can from them. But of course, we're always respecting kind of our unique role and our unique situation as our profession. And, Pam, I wanted to kind of make one other point, because this is something that's at least been relatively new that maybe some listeners may not be aware of regarding clinical education. And that's the Journal of Clinical Education that's recently been out. And I think that's, from what I've read thus far, I mean, that seems like a great avenue that's going to address or contribute to looking more at that clinical education piece.
Right. I completely agree. So that we'll now have, hopefully, two journals, the Journal of Physical Therapy Education, or JOPTE, that's the Academy's journal, which is broad spectrum. The new journal out of Columbia, I believe, is focused on clinical education. And it reflects our increasing understanding that teaching in the classroom and teaching in the clinical setting are maybe and are sometimes, but not always, different animals. The other thing that it reflects is something that the Academy, I think, has really put in the forefront now, and that is that the Academy is not just interested in education in the classroom, and not just clinical education for entry level, because those have been the real foci, but also post-professional education. What does education look like at the residency, internship, fellowship level? And what does education look like beyond that? So even if you are already a board-certified clinical specialist, what are your next steps? What are the steps for folks who don't choose a residency fellowship route or a clinical specialization route? What does their education look like? And one thing that we really have not emphasized in the Academy, and that is, how do we educate our patients and their families? So really including the patients and families as targets of educational strategies as well. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we'll see that in both journals in the future.
No, I completely agree. And Pam, it's been really good to get some perspective on, all the initiatives and stuff going on with the task force and all the other avenues that you had mentioned. We kind of like to follow up with our last question here, which is kind of our big cheese, if you will. And this is a big question. So this does not have to be specifically to entry level. This could be post-professional. This could be any avenue of education that you think. And the question is, if you could change one aspect of healthcare education, DPT or otherwise, which aspect would you change and how would you change it?
Well, I have to say, Brandon, I'm glad you gave me this question ahead of time, because I think I would just like be blithering right now. And, hopefully the listeners recognize that I could go almost anywhere with this question. So I decided to take, I think, one smaller goal and then one bigger goal. And I've mentioned both of these things, but I think that smaller goal, and it's not trivial, it's not low-hanging fruit, but I think in the scheme of goals, this is still smaller. And that is to, again, find ways to get institutions to value qualitative, mixed methods, and quantitative educational research as being sufficiently rigorous to qualify candidates who publish and disseminate for promotion and tenure. And we need to recognize this within our own profession. And that means whether you're going for or have an EDD or a PhD in education, that those are degrees that we need to support to increase the quality of professional education in the rehabilitation professions. We can certainly get into also the fact that this can be interprofessional, interdisciplinary. We can pull in medicine, nursing, OT, SLP, and their efforts to collaborate on better educational research. But I think recognizing that this is just as good and in some ways tackles a whole different set of, well, not some ways, it tackles a whole different set of problems than the so-called randomized controlled trials, what we typically think of as clinical research. So it's not small, but in the scheme of things, it's smaller than many of our goals in educational research. Mm-hmm. The big goal, I think, is around the outcomes. And I've talked about that already. That's one of our big challenges in clinical research, and it's even more difficult in educational research. So that's the huge goal. Can we develop outcomes, and they don't have to be quantitative, but can we develop outcomes that maybe would constitute some kind of minimal data set that people agree should be part of educational research, depending on what kind of research you're doing, so that we don't have this proliferation of all different outcomes, which means that we can't compare studies. So I think that's one of our biggest challenges.
Well, I'm glad you say that because, ironically, that's probably not an answer I've really heard for this last question often on this show. I think the number one, of course, what seems to be like beating a dead horse is cost, seems to be number one above everything. Two is more along the lines of clinical education, curriculum, kind of that kind of thing. And then three is usually more around interprofessional education. So I love it when we get answers that are not that, so that get different avenues of it, because I think that's so important.
Well, if we had all the money in the world, Brandon, we would still need to tackle these two goals that I mentioned.
Oh, absolutely.
So yes, is funding an issue? Absolutely. We could come up, every one of the answers you hear is a very legitimate issue. Mm-hmm. But again, if we throw all the money in the world at these issues, they're still not going to be easy to solve.
Right. Right. That can only get part of it. It's a lot of the other avenues. And you kind of even mentioned before, kind of like the program, the internal limitations or barriers that exist there. Because I completely agree. And that's something that other guests have mentioned as well. Not on this issue specifically, but along other topics as well. So no, I think that's a good point.
Brandon, one of the things I'd like to just point out is there's been a lot of discussion about what is educational research.
Yeah.
Your listeners may hear the term SOTL, S-O-T-L, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Does that, encompass what educational research is? If you go to the Academy new website and you click on the research link, there's a definition there that comes from the American Educational Research Association. And it's a definition, it's a bit longish. So again, that's why I'll point people towards the website. But they have what's agreed as probably the most comprehensive definition. And I'd like to read it if I might. And again, go to the website, click on research. So educational research is the scientific field of study that examines education and learning processes, as well as the human attributes, interactions, organizations, and institutions that shape educational outcomes. Scholarship in the field seeks to describe, understand, and explain how learning takes place throughout a person's life and how formal and informal contexts of education affect all forms of learning. And then the last part is that it embraces the full spectrum of methods, as well as drives the development of new tools and methods. This is absolutely the most comprehensive definition. So if we think back to this concept of how do we look at what's being done in educational research, this definition really highlights the fact that it is a huge field. It's huge. And there's just so much that can be done in there, but it's not limiting at all. So promoting scholarship within an institution and methods to do that falls within this area. So again, I hope your listeners will take a look at it because it's a terrific and all-encompassing definition that also identifies for us the challenges we have ahead.
No, indeed. And I really appreciate you sharing that because that kind of gives kind of an overall definition and a way to start. Because like you had said, we don't want to get into proliferation of different interpretations, different definitions, different outcomes. And we just want to keep everyone on the same page so that we can actually compare, contrast, and actually move forward optimally. So I really do appreciate you sharing that. And also spending the time today to really give insight into this, as I know our listeners and are going to really appreciate this as I do. And Pam, you had mentioned the APTE website. Are there any other links to APTE or anything other online resources that you would recommend for people that want to maybe look into this to learn a little bit more?
On the Academy APTE website, there is a link to resources. And I think you'll find, there'll probably some duplicates on the ACAP website as well. So they will send you to other places and to other websites. So I think there's a lot there to be mined. And I certainly encourage your listeners to go to those resources, click on the links, and they will take you to the educational research sites from other professions as well.
Love it. And guys, if you do want to check that out, feel free to just scroll down and you'll find it in the show notes there easily. You can just click it and it'll take you right there. Well, Pam, thank you so much for coming on today, sharing your insight, and for all that you do. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, it was my great pleasure as well, Brandon, and thank you for asking me.
Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available on our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.